For a moment, everything is silent. British soldiers check their watches, grip their rifles tighter, and whisper final prayers. Then, without warning, the night sky erupts into hell itself. Over 1,000 artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The ground shakes. The noise is so deafening it can be heard 60 miles away in Alexandria. Shells rain down on German and Italian positions in what will become one of the most devastating barrages of the entire Second World War. This is the opening salvo of the Second Battle of El Alamein, battle that would determine the fate of North Africa, the Middle East, and perhaps the entire war. Winston Churchill would later declare, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." To understand what happened at El Alamein, we need to go back to the summer of 1942, a time when the British Empire stood on the edge of catastrophe in North Africa. The story begins in the scorching desert wastes between Egypt and Libya, where two armies had been locked in a brutal back-and-forth campaign for over 2 years. On one side stood the British Eighth Army, defending Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the vital sea routes that sustained the British war effort. On the other stood the Axis forces, Germans and Italians combined under one of history's most celebrated military commanders, Generalfield Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. Rommel was unlike any opponent the British had faced. Brilliant, audacious, and utterly ruthless, he had turned the North African campaign into his personal chess game. His trademark was the lightning strike, attacking where least expected, moving faster than his enemies could react, turning British victories into desperate retreats with almost supernatural cunning. By the summer of 1942, Rommel had pushed the British to the breaking point. After his stunning victory at the Battle of Gazala in May and June, Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika surged eastward into Egypt, and suddenly the unthinkable became possible. The fall of the Suez Canal, the gateway to British oil supplies in Persia, and the collapse of the entire Middle Eastern theater. The British Eighth Army was in full retreat, shattered and demoralized. Tank crews abandoned their vehicles, infantry units scattered. It seemed nothing could stop the Desert Fox from seizing Alexandria, Cairo, and everything beyond. But then, British General Claude Auchinleck made a decision that would change everything. Instead of falling back to the established defensive positions at Mersa Matruh, Auchinleck ordered his battered forces to make a stand at an obscure railway halt called El Alamein. It wasn't a random choice. El Alamein occupied a unique position on the map, a natural bottleneck between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and an impassable wasteland to the south. This wasteland was called the Qattara Depression, vast expanse of salt marshes and soft sand that would swallow any vehicle foolish enough to attempt crossing it. The depression was a natural barrier that couldn't be outflanked. It created a corridor only 40 miles wide where armies had to meet face to face. No more of Rommel's famous sweeping flanking maneuvers. At El Alamein, there would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In early July 1942, the First Battle of El Alamein began. Rommel threw his forces against the new British line, probing for weaknesses, looking for the breakthrough that had served him so well before. The battle became a grinding, bloody stalemate that neither side could win. By late July, both armies were exhausted. The front line stabilized, but the situation remained desperately dangerous for Britain. One successful push could still spell disaster. In London, Winston Churchill was furious. He had watched defeat after defeat in North Africa. He needed a victory not just for strategic reasons, but to prove to the British people, to the Americans, to the world, that Britain could still fight and win. Auchinleck had stopped Rommel, but stopping wasn't enough. Churchill wanted the Desert Fox crushed. So Churchill did what desperate leaders do. He changed commanders. In August 1942, a new commander arrived in Egypt to take control of the Eighth Army. His name was Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery, though history would remember him simply as Monty. Montgomery was not what anyone expected. While Rommel was dashing and charismatic, Montgomery was meticulous and methodical. He was brash, arrogant, and absolutely convinced of his own brilliance qualities. That made him deeply unpopular with fellow officers, but strangely beloved by ordinary soldiers. He wore an Australian bush hat instead of a proper officer's cap, spoke directly to his troops in plain language, and radiated absolute confidence even in the darkest moments. When Montgomery took command, he made an immediate assessment. The Eighth Army was broken. Every man in the desert had heard the stories of the Desert Fox's genius. His impossible victories, his seemingly supernatural ability to appear where he couldn't possibly be. Montgomery's first task wasn't tactical, it was psychological. He needed his men to believe again. He began by doing something radical. He told them they would win. Not we'll try our best, or we'll fight bravely. He flat out promised them victory. He told them when the battle would start, how long it would last, and that when it was over, Rommel would be in full retreat. To soldiers who had known nothing but retreat and defeat, this bordered on insanity. But Montgomery's absolute certainty was infectious. Then he did something even more important. He made them wait. Churchill was screaming for an immediate attack. Every day Rommel's forces remained in Egypt was another day closer to catastrophe. But Montgomery refused to be rushed. He understood something crucial. Britain's greatest advantages were not being used. Resources were pouring into Egypt: new tanks, new guns, new aircraft, new divisions of fresh troops. Rommel's supply lines, by contrast, stretched back across the Mediterranean, where British submarines and aircraft hunted Italian and German cargo ships with deadly efficiency. Time, Montgomery realized, was on his side. Every week he delayed was another week for his forces to grow stronger while Rommel's grew weaker. Every day brought more Sherman tanks from America, more 6-pounder anti-tank guns, more Spitfires to dominate the skies. Intelligence reports confirmed his strategy. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, reading encrypted German communications through the Ultra program, revealed the desperate state of Axis logistics. Rommel was starving for fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The panzer divisions that had terrorized the desert were down to a fraction of their strength. There was another intelligence victory that would prove crucial. Earlier in 1942, the Germans had been intercepting American diplomatic messages from Cairo, giving Rommel detailed information about British positions and plans. But in June, the leak was discovered and plugged. Suddenly, Rommel was blind. Meanwhile, British intelligence could read his every move through ultra decrypts. The hunter had become the hunted. While Montgomery built up his forces, Rommel tried one last desperate gamble. In late August, at the Battle of Alam Halfa, he launched what would be his final major offensive in North Africa. Montgomery had read the intelligence reports. He knew exactly when and where Rommel would attack. When the panzers came, they drove straight into prepared British positions and were slaughtered. Rommel retreated, having lost tanks and men he couldn't replace. After Alam Halfa, Rommel knew his situation was hopeless. He couldn't attack effectively, and he knew Montgomery's counteroffensive was coming. So he did the only thing he could. He built fortifications. The German and Italian troops dug in, creating defensive positions protected by the most extensive minefields ever laid in the desert. 500,000 mines were planted, creating barriers 5.5 miles deep in some places. They called these deadly fields the Devil's Gardens, and with good reason. Any attack would have to cross this metal sea of death under constant fire from dug-in anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. Rommel believed these fortifications would bleed Montgomery's army white, just as trenches had done to British forces in World War I. He expected a long defensive battle where British numerical superiority would be negated by German defensive skill. What Rommel didn't know was that Montgomery was planning exactly that kind of battle, and he intended to win it. By late October 1942, Montgomery had assembled a force that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The numbers were staggering. The Eighth Army now comprised over 195,000 men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, France, Greece, and Poland, a truly multinational force united against fascism. They possessed 1,029 tanks, including 252 of the new American Sherman tanks that could finally match German panzers in combat. Over 900 artillery pieces stood ready to rain death on Axis positions. In the skies above, the Royal Air Force had achieved near total air superiority. Facing them was a Panzerarmee Afrika reduced to approximately 100,000 men, only 489 tanks, many of them outdated Italian models, and a desperate shortage of fuel, ammunition, and hope. The numbers told the story. Montgomery had overwhelming superiority, but Rommel still had his Devil's Gardens and his defensive positions. This wouldn't be a walkover. Montgomery knew it would be what he called an attrition battle, a brutal, grinding slog where both sides would suffer terribly, but where his superior numbers would eventually prevail. He was planning a World War I battle in the middle of World War II, and on October 23, 1942, it began. At exactly 9:40 p.m., the artillery opened fire. British and Commonwealth guns unleashed a barrage that turned night into day. For 4 hours, shells rained down on Axis positions. German and Italian soldiers huddled in their bunkers as the earth itself seemed to tear apart above them. Then came the infantry. Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery called it, a darkly ironic name for what would be one of the war's bloodiest advances. The plan was methodical. Infantry and engineers would advance through the minefields under cover of darkness, clearing 2 corridors through the Devil's Gardens. Sappers crawled forward with mine detectors, marking safe paths with white tape while machine gun fire and artillery shells exploded around them. It was terrifying, exhausting work where one misstep meant instant death. Behind the infantry came the 10th Corps Montgomery's armored divisions. Once the corridors were cleared, the tanks would pour through and engage Rommel's panzers in open combat. At least that was the plan. Reality, as always, was messier. The minefields were deeper and more complex than expected. Engineers worked through the night, but progress was agonizingly slow. When dawn came on October 24th, the armored corps was still stuck behind the infantry, unable to break through to open ground. The element of surprise was gone. Now it would be a straight fight. Rommel wasn't even there when the battle began. He was in Germany on sick leave, trying to recover from the stomach ailments and exhaustion that plagued him. His replacement, General Georg Stumm, died of a heart attack during the opening bombardment, literally shocked to death by the ferocity of Montgomery's assault. Rommel rushed back to Afrika on October 25th, flying through the night to reach his beleaguered forces. But when he arrived and surveyed the battlefield, even the desert fox must have felt the weight of reality settling on his shoulders. His intelligence reports, fed by ultra-intercepts that he didn't know were compromised, told him the truth. Montgomery had too many men, too many tanks, too much of everything. The fuel tanks were nearly empty, ammunition was running low, and the British just kept coming. What followed was 12 days of hell. Montgomery called this phase the dogfight, a grinding battle of attrition where both armies tore at each other like savage beasts locked in combat. Neither side could break through, but neither would retreat. The Australian 9th Division fought with particular ferocity in the northern sector, near a position called Point 29. These were the same men who had defended Tobruk during Rommel's siege months earlier. They had scores to settle, and they fought with a fury that shocked even hardened German veterans. For days, they launched limited attacks, forcing Rommel to commit his precious panzer reserves to hold the line. This was exactly what Montgomery wanted. He called it crumbling, launching small attacks all along the line to wear down Axis strength bit by bit, forcing Rommel to use his limited fuel and ammunition to respond to constant threats. On October 26th, Montgomery tried to break through in the northern sector. The attack failed. Casualties mounted. Critics began whispering that Montgomery had made a terrible mistake, that he was repeating the horrors of World War I's static slaughter, but Montgomery stayed calm. He had predicted this would happen. He had told his staff before the battle began exactly how long it would take and approximately how many casualties to expect. Everything was going according to his plan, not the plan his critics wanted. He shifted tactics. If he couldn't break through in the north, he'd threaten in the south, force Rommel to spread his forces thin, then strike where the line was weakest. The battle became a chess game played with human lives. Attack, retreat, regroup, attack again. German 88mm anti-tank guns took a terrible toll on British armor. But for every British tank destroyed, Montgomery had 2 more to replace it. Rommel had none. By November 1st, the Axis position was critical. Rommel's after-action reports, intercepted by Ultra, made for grim reading. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. The Italian infantry divisions, lacking motorized transport, were essentially immobile. If the line broke, they would be left behind to be captured. The German panzer divisions had been ground down to shadows of their former strength. The 15th Panzer Division was down to 30 tanks. The 21st Panzer Division had even fewer. Rommel knew the battle was lost. He sent a message to Hitler's headquarters requesting permission to withdraw before his entire army was destroyed. Hitler's response was unequivocal: victory or death. Not one step backward would be permitted. It was one of the most catastrophic decisions of the war. On November 2nd, Montgomery launched his final blow, Operation Supercharge. He had identified a weak point in the Axis line held by Italian divisions, already exhausted from days of fighting. Montgomery concentrated his remaining strength-fresh divisions that had been held in reserve, every available tank, maximum artillery support, and struck with overwhelming force. The Italian defenders fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The line crumpled. British armor poured through the gap. Rommel faced the choice no commander wants to make: obey orders and watch his army die, or disobey and save what he could. On November 3rd, Rommel made his decision. He would retreat. Hitler's order be damned, he would not sacrifice his men for a position that couldn't be held. But by then, it was almost too late. The Italian infantry, lacking trucks and half-tracks, couldn't retreat fast enough. Many surrendered. Others fought hopeless rearguard actions to buy time for the German motorized units to escape. The British 1st and 7th Armored Divisions, along with the 2nd New Zealand Division, raced forward in pursuit. The great chase across the desert had begun. But here Montgomery made what many historians consider his greatest mistake of the battle. He was too cautious. Rommel's forces were broken, scattered, desperately low on fuel. A more aggressive pursuit might have trapped and destroyed the entire Panzerarmee Afrika right there, ending the North African campaign months earlier. But Montgomery, meticulous as always, worried about overextending his supply lines. He advanced methodically, allowing Rommel's remaining forces to escape across Libya. Still, the victory was complete. The Second Battle of El Alamein was over. The Axis had suffered approximately 37,000 casualties, over 30% of their entire force. Rommel lost 500 tanks, countless guns, and thousands of irreplaceable veterans. The 8th Army suffered 13,500 casualties, terrible by any measure, but sustainable given their numerical superiority and flow of replacements. More important than the numbers was what the battle represented. For the first time in the war, a German army commanded by one of Hitler's best generals had been decisively beaten in conventional combat. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The timing of El Alamein's conclusion was almost perfect. On November 8th, just days after Rommel began his retreat, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. Suddenly, Rommel wasn't just retreating. He was caught in a vice. British forces pushed from the east, American forces pressed from the west. The Afrika Corps, once the terror of the desert, was being squeezed out of existence. The psychological impact of El Alamein cannot be overstated. In Britain, church bells rang for the first time since 1940, silent since the threat of German invasion. They now pealed in celebration of a victory that felt almost impossible. British morale, which had sagged through years of defeat and setback, soared. Churchill, who had staked his political future on victory in North Africa, could finally breathe again. For the Axis, El Alamein was a disaster compounded by other disasters. While Rommel retreated across North Africa, the German 6th Army was being encircled at Stalingrad. Hitler's empire had reached its maximum extent. From this point forward, it would only shrink. Montgomery became a national hero overnight. Monty was the man who had beaten Rommel, the first British general to do so decisively. His fame would last the rest of his life, though it would always be tinged with controversy about his caution and his enormous ego. For Rommel, El Alamein marked the beginning of the end. He would fight on, conducting brilliant defensive battles as he retreated across North Africa, but the strategic initiative was lost forever. By May 1943, all Axis forces in North Africa would surrender. Rommel himself would be recalled to Europe, later suspected of involvement in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and forced to commit suicide in 1944. The battle's legacy extended far beyond North Africa. El Alamein proved that Allied forces could match German military skill when properly led and equipped. It demonstrated the value of intelligence superiority. The ultra-decrypts and the closing of information leaks had given Montgomery a crucial edge. It showed that overwhelming material superiority, intelligently applied, could overcome tactical brilliance. Perhaps most importantly, El Alamein gave the Allies momentum. After years of defeats, withdrawals, and barely averted catastrophes, they finally had an unambiguous victory. The tide was turning. Churchill's words would prove prophetic. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning. The Second Battle of El Alamein was fought in one of the most desolate places. On earth, a wasteland of sand and rock where nothing grew and no one lived, yet its effects rippled across the globe. It secured the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields. It preserved British influence in the Mediterranean. It gave American forces their first taste of combat against the Germans. It demonstrated that the Axis could be beaten in conventional warfare. But beyond strategy and logistics, El Alamein represented something more fundamental. It was proof that fascism was not invincible, that democracy could organize, fight, and win. The men who fought there, British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, French, Greek, Polish, German, and Italian, endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They fought through minefields that turned earth into death traps. They charged into artillery barrages that shredded flesh and metal with equal indifference. They watched friends die in the desert sand, far from home, fighting for causes they hoped were worth the price. In the end, El Alamein stands as one of World War II's truly decisive battles. Not the largest, not the bloodiest, but a genuine turning point where the course of history pivoted from Axis ascendancy to Allied victory. Today, war cemeteries mark the battlefield. Row upon row of headstones stand in the desert, marking where men from dozens of nations gave their lives in the sand. The railway halt of El Alamein, once unknown to the world, has become a symbol of sacrifice and turning points. When we remember World War II, we often think of D-Day, Stalingrad, or Midway. But before any of those victories, there was El Alamein, the battle, where Britain proved it could still win, where Montgomery outfought Rommel, where the tide of war began finally to turn. As Churchill wrote in his memoirs, before Alamein we never had a victory, after Alamein we never had a defeat. In the desert, in the autumn of 1942, the beginning of the end began. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more World War II history. Leave a comment below telling us which battle you'd like us to cover next. Remember the fallen, honor their sacrifice. Learn from history. Until next time.